Good evening, my friends. Are you here for another story? Then come on in. Have a drink, a bite to eat, and settle in by the fire. For tonight, I have quite the tale to tell. Are you ready? Good. Then let us begin. Let us venture back from the international scale of things and return to creepy true stories from those wooded foothills of my youth. As I've said before, the Appalachian Mountains and the land surrounding them is steeped in a long and sordid history. From the Cherokee to pioneers to Civil War battles and beyond, it is nearly too much for the mind to comprehend just how many lives have trodden those hills and forests. Because of that, there are many old graveyards, abandoned buildings, and ancient places that seem to exude strange and wondrous activity. Tonight, I will be bringing you a story from one of my excursions far out into the forest in order to try to uncover the truth behind one particularly strange sight. Those of you who are fans of my now defunct creepypasta channel may recall a story similar to this one. It is in fact a redo of an old video which is no longer available to the public and was, perhaps, the only true story that I ever shared on there. So gather around, friends, and listen well. I give you Exoneration. This story takes place a few years before I began my old creepypasta channel. During the spring of 2007 or 2008. I remember this because it just so happened to be either the year of or after the year of the cursed red jogging pants. A story that was not so much mortifying as hilarious. But that is a story for another video. This all started when I happened to overhear my papa telling my mother about someone he was calling a witch. I figured that when he said there was a witch buried nearby, he was just talking about an old spiteful woman. Basically the B word, just with the same fervor behind it. It wasn't a word that Papa used very often, as he is more of the type to just cut ties and never talk about someone who has done him dirty before. So to hear him actually insulting someone, and a woman in particular, yeah, I had to hear more about this one. Just what had some lady done that was so mean for Papa to call her that? So I asked him. As it turned out, he wasn't talking smack about someone. He was referring to a local legend of someone who really was supposed to have been a witch. There wasn't really any details on her, as even the community she had lived in had long since perished. The only thing that remained was the story and her grave. A grave that lay perpendicular to all others surrounding it. Now, with very few exceptions, you hardly ever heard tale of an actual witch in those parts. Or at least, from the time period this person was supposed to have been buried, which would have been sometime during the 1800s. So that got me to thinking, was there really a witch buried there? Knowing how deep some of the mountain beliefs ran, and how my own brushes with folks who were religious only in name back there went, I had my doubts as to this being a real witch. Most burials in Western society involve the corpse being interred with the head pointed west and the feet pointed east. This stems predominantly from an old Christian belief that when the rapture occurs, the loyal souls belonging to the Lord will raise up and face the east, where Jesus himself is foretold to have his second coming. For the record, yes, I have heard of various other cultures and religions burying their dead to face the same way for other reasons, but this is the Appalachian mountain region I'm referring to, and therefore, this would have been pretty much the only reason why this funerary practice would have been done at the time. However, there are a handful of people throughout history in the region that were buried perpendicular. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is witch, because the notion was such a scandalous, creepy thing back in those superstitious hillfolk communities. But it really was rare for someone to actually be called out as a witch and buried that way. Considering how some families will fight for even the slightest pretenses associated with their names and communities to go away, even if they had hated the other person, then it would have been a huge deal for anyone with even the slightest ties to someone else to have been buried as a witch. Something like that would have been as telling as Hester's big red A from the Scarlet Letter. What most people tend to forget is that supposed witches weren't the only ones buried facing another direction. The only two I can remember right now that would sometimes be buried differently are suicides and assassins. Initially, this was actually modified from a practice stretching back to Anglo-Saxon times, when people who killed themselves or were branded as traitors were buried at crossroads. Apparently, there were quite a few criminals interred at crossroads for a time under the superstition that, if the restless soul were to come back, then it wouldn't know where to go to continue to cause mischief. I'm guessing for suicides, it might have been to keep them from going after the person who drove them to that, or masked their death as a suicide and didn't want the ghost coming after the murderer. I don't know. Medieval times were odd. Eventually, the practice was abolished by the British Parliament after two particular deaths: the suicide of Lord Castlereagh in 1822, and the 1823 crossroads execution and burial of the patricidal Abel Griffiths. However, this was half a century after the American colonies had successfully split from Great Britain, and mountain folk over here didn't have any reason to listen to people governing another country. But why the change from crossroads burial to the north to south position in the graveyard? Maybe it was because a lot of mountain folk never really left their communities to go very far. There wasn't much use of hauling a body out into the unknown when a discarded plot of land at the northern part of the cemetery would do, especially in winter. Have you ever tried to haul a body in winter with several feet of snow on the ground, with only horses for transport, if that? Me either, but I imagine it would be difficult. Considering only a few other older folks I asked had ever heard of it, that made me wonder if it wasn't suicide that just got the moniker of witch tacked to it as some sort of ghost tale to spook the kids. There is the possibility that it could have just been an outcast without much family who was labeled as a witch. But considering how deep tales run in our heritage, yeah, scandals like that can last for generations, as I explained in the video The Shriner's Ghost. And what of the idea that she was an actual witch? As I covered in the Tea Reader, certain forms of divination and fortune-telling practices were gauged on different levels. Most people were apt to put a spin on whatever sort of herbal medicine they were doing, and certain practices that may have been passed down through Native American, Irish, and African ancestry usually got different Christian spin on them as they were incorporated into the larger community beliefs. That's why certain superstitions and behaviors can still be traced back to practices from those lineages, even though they might be considered typical Christian Appalachian beliefs. And considering how many different denominations and branches of those denominations there are throughout the region, it is very difficult to call someone out on minor beliefs when the teachings of their church and community fall into play. Since most of these little mountain communities hardly ever ventured out of their region except to visit relatives, find spouses, or join the military, you had to either be devoid of family and absolutely abhorred by the community to be labeled as a witch, or paraded around like you were carrying a huge flag. Don't get me wrong, when bad things happened to those old mountain folk, back before there were vaccines or weather reports or even modern education, and given how little that can be in some instances, that should say a lot, there are occasions they look to see if someone could be hexing them. And yeah, there are plenty of instances of this neighbor or that neighbor being a supposed witch. But there are very few instances that I could find anywhere, in the Appalachias or in the other places in the U.S., of someone being buried the wrong way in a community that existed around the same time period. So why was this woman buried the wrong way? I had hoped that my papa could get me a rubbing from the tombstone. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, it's when you put a piece of paper over a tombstone face and rub a pencil lead over the surface until the outline of the epitaph is made. It's most often used for finding names and dates on very old tombstones that have had their engravings worn away over time, which I suspected would be the case here. Instead, Papa just tells me, "You can go see it for yourself." At this point, I'm all excited. I had to wait a few weeks because the place where this grave is happens to be way out in a hunting preserve, and turkey season was still going. Even though they had a cutoff point during the days for hunters to be out so visitors could go in, Papa was the only one who knew where this was, and he really wanted to bag a turkey before we went on this big trek. When we finally got there, it took us around 2 hours to get to the actual grave site, mostly because everybody was stopping to sightsee, hit mud puddles until they were half dry, or for bathroom breaks. By the time we got there, I'm sunburnt to a crisp, I'm exhausted, and I know I'm going to have to get up for work and school the next day. But I'm hanging in there because I really want to see this grave. When I was just about to burst from holding that excitement in, we finally crested over a hill, and I saw it. The tiny dirt path leading down the middle of what was once a graveyard. You see, ages ago, there used to be a church there with a little graveyard around it. By the time the land was sold to the Wildlife and Fishery Association of the state that this place was in, for it to be turned into a hunting preserve, the church was long since gone, and most of the land lay fallow as timberland for many years. You had trees sprouting between gravestones, literal slabs of stone, not the pretty marbled grave markers and epitaph-etched statuary of modern cemeteries. Several of the graves had given way to sinkholes, and others were buried halfway in briar thickets where deer or quail would hide. I even saw a groundhog hole right at the head of one. If I hadn't recognized it for what it was, and was about 15 years younger at the time, I might have thought a zombie crawled out of it. Anyway, I'm not quite sure why there was a dirt path running through this graveyard instead of around it, but whoever decided to dig that route had long since left the organization that first founded the hunting preserve. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that the graveyard was fairly spread out, and that the safest path to cut down to the water with the land available at the time was through there, because a good portion of the land around this lake was surrounded by rocky cliff sides that had major drop-offs. In fact, if you looked out from this small area by the water, you could see a few fine Lakeview homes across the lake. It made me wonder, given the history of the area, if any of them ever saw any strange lights or heard odd sounds coming from this area at night, as you would expect of these potentially haunted graveyards. What I do know was that a lot of the graves had to be moved off to the side. In some cases, there were no remains left besides the grave markers, and in those instances, you could see about 4 or 5 that had been stacked off to the side near one of the graves. The most recent of the graves was that of a woman who had died in the very early 1900s, with the majority being between 1820 and 1860. There was even a grave of a very long-lived Revolutionary War soldier I found in what was possibly a sinkhole that had settled long ago, meaning more dirt had fallen in and it had eventually smoothed out into levelish ground again. Now, I had no idea where this particular grave was, so, after wandering around for about 10 minutes looking at the old markers, I asked Papa to show me. Up a steep embankment from the road, we took maybe a 5-minute walk before we came to 4 oddly spaced patches of daffodils, the corners of where the old church used to be. For those of you that have ever been out in the backwoods in the South, know that patches of daffodils, tiger lilies, or irises are fairly common garden plants due to their hardy nature. When you find them spaced out strangely, mentally draw a line between the bunches and see if that makes a straight line or 4 corners. If you can, then most likely that was the site of a house or church that has long since been demolished. After crossing the expanse of thick grass where the church once stood, there, off in the distance, was the very grave I had been looking for. My papa was right. Even from a distance, I could tell that this grave was perpendicular from the others. In fact, it looked like a grave that had not been dug at all. Rather, in this lonely corner of the woods, so far away from all the other graves, was a mound of rocks without a headstone in sight. This only added to the strangeness of the situation. Did these people fear this woman so much that they heaped rocks upon her so as to ensure that she would not move? Or was it something far less heinous, like the grave's occupant having died in winter, and rocks were used to shield the body from stray beasts since the ground was too frozen to dig through? All of this was strange for certain, but not a single one of these oddities stuck out so much as this last one did. A tree. Not just any tree, but one so wide that I could not wrap my arms around even half of it. This tree dwarfed all of the others throughout the preserve by leaps and bounds, and it was coming out from the head of the grave, as if to replace the grave marker that this woman had been denied. I could not help but look around at the rest of the graveyard, with its stones haphazardly dotting the brush. How many of them had known this person in life, had helped bury her? How many of them had hated her so much that they helped mound these rocks upon her? Was she really so hated and friendless that she had to be banished to the far end of the graveyard, forever marked in death by a perpendicular grave? Or was she like some I've known, merely an outcast, one who didn't fit in, and whose few friends were so cowed by their neighbors and relatives that they would do nothing to stop her unjust burial? Was she interred with such extreme prejudice, so that, perhaps, no one would stand up to claims made on what was perhaps a poor widow's land? I pondered this for a long time, but deep down, I felt I knew what the answer was. After all, the community itself had long since dispersed, its members as dead as she who had long been interred before them. It was not her grave that karma had chosen would be one of the ones uprooted and scooched over so that drunken, laughing teenagers could zoom their ATVs down to the lake. In a way, by their having exiled this person's grave far away from theirs, they had inevitably ensured that it would be the one most safe from relocation. So too did the giant tree that loomed overhead. And as I looked up at that tall, majestic tree, witnessing how it towered over all the others as it reached far heavenward, I could not help but feel that in death her false crimes had finally been exonerated. Well, my friends, what do you suppose was the most likely reason for the conditions of her grave? Do you believe she was merely the scapegoat of ancient hill folk, or a truly terrifying mountain witch? Put your theory in the comments below. If you liked this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with all of your friends. If you want to catch my new content before it reaches YouTube, then head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/phantasmalpoppy. Pledging even $1 a month gives you early access to my new videos, as well as content that may be too dark for YouTube. It also helps me out, so thanks in advance. Finally, be sure to hit the notification bell before you go. That way, you can catch my next spooky story the moment it comes out. Also, I do apologize if my voice sounded a little weird in this one. I woke up with a sore throat this morning and I'm kind of battling it. I really hope it's allergies. I think it is, because I went running yesterday for the first time this season, and then my sore throat developed a couple hours afterwards, so I'm pretty sure it's that. At least I'm hoping anyway. Fingers crossed. Good night, and see you all real soon.